The man didn't even let her finish her first sentence. Silas Whitmore stepped out from the edge of the crowd before Evelyn Carter had taken 3 steps off the stagecoach, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to throw away. He wasn't the rancher she'd come to marry. He was nobody she'd ever seen before, but he moved like someone who owned the ground she was standing on, and everyone around him went quiet the moment he opened his mouth. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole station to hear, "she's got the boy." That was all. 4 words. And something in the crowd shifted. She felt it before she could explain it. A collective exhale, a pulling back, like people stepping away from a fire. Evelyn tightened her grip on Noah's hand, and the little boy pressed into her side, confused, feeling the cold before he could understand why. She had crossed 800 miles for a life. What she got was 4 words in a crowd that was already deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. If you've ever been judged before anyone even learned your name, if you've ever felt a door close before you could raise your hand to knock, then stay with this story. Because what happened to Evelyn Carter in the spring of 1887 will make you question what kind of person you would have been standing in that crowd. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories we tell here. Hit the like button if this is already pulling at something in your chest. And leave a comment with your city and your country. I want to know how far this story has traveled, how many lives it has found its way into. Now let's go back to Dry Creek, and to the morning Evelyn Carter's whole world turned on a single moment of unexpected kindness. She had packed her life into 1 trunk and a carpet bag. That was the honest accounting of it. Everything she owned after the creditors came for the house, after the funeral costs took what remained of her savings, after she sent the last letter to her late husband's family and received nothing back but silence. The trunk held 2 dresses, a wool coat that had seen better winters, Noah's wooden horse, a handful of books she refused to leave behind, and a small tin box containing the letters. 41 of them, written over 8 months, from a rancher in Wyoming Territory named Harold Baines, who had described himself as a decent, hard-working man of 34, a widower with 200 acres of grazing land and a house with real glass windows. She had not described herself as beautiful. She'd been careful about that. What she had written was true. She was 29 years old. She could cook and sew and keep accounts. She was not afraid of hard work, and she had a son named Noah, age 6, whose father had died of fever 3 winters ago. She had written that last part clearly, twice, because she was not the kind of woman who arrived somewhere under false pretenses. She had believed Harold Baines was not the kind of man who read only what he wanted to see. She had been wrong about that. The stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that looked prettier than it felt. Blue sky, the smell of pine somewhere on the wind, the mountains sitting white-capped on the horizon like they had nothing to do with the people scrambling around at their feet. Evelyn stepped down first, then turned and lifted Noah by the waist, setting him beside her on the packed dirt. I was wearing his good shirt, and his hair was combed flat, and he immediately looked around with the wide, undefended interest of a child who hasn't yet learned that a new place might not want him. "Is that him?" Noah asked, tugging her sleeve. "I don't know yet," she said. "Hold my hand." The station platform was busy. A Tuesday delivery apparently brought enough traffic to draw a good portion of the town. There were men checking freight, women with baskets, a cluster of older men near the hitching post doing what older men do near hitching posts, which is mostly stand and watch. Evelyn scanned the faces looking for someone who matched the description in the letters. Harold had written that he was tall, light-haired, that he'd be wearing a green vest because she'd need something to recognize him by. She spotted the green vest before she spotted the face above it. He was tall, yes, and fair, and he was already walking toward her with a kind of purposeful stride that for one brief, foolish second made her think, this might be all right. And then he stopped so completely that a man behind him nearly walked into his back, and she watched his face go through several expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Recognition, recalculation, and then something that settled into the particular coldness of a man who has decided he's been cheated. "You're Evelyn Carter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "And you must be— you've got a boy with you." She felt Noah press tighter against her leg. She kept her voice level. "Yes, I mentioned Noah in my letters several times. His father passed when he was— You never mentioned he'd be coming with you." Harold's jaw had gone stiff. The kind of stiff that meant he was saying one thing and feeling another, and what he was feeling had nowhere good to go. A child wasn't part of what I agreed to. I wrote very clearly that I have a son. I have the letters if you'd like to. I'd like you to go back where you came from. The words fell out of him flat and final, like something he'd already rehearsed, or maybe like something he was saying to convince himself as much as her. Evelyn stood very still. She was aware, distantly, of the crowd that had gathered. Not rushing to see exactly, but drifting in that slow sideways way people drift when they sense a scene developing and don't want to miss it, but don't want to appear to want to miss it. She was also aware of the boy beside her, who had gone very quiet. "Mr. Baines," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, because she had a child with her and she would not break in front of her child. "I have traveled 800 miles in good faith. I disclosed everything relevant to our arrangement. If you have questions or concerns, I am willing to discuss them, but I will not be spoken to this way in the middle of a public street." Something flickered in his face. She thought for a moment she'd reached something, some older instinct toward decency that might surface if she gave it room. Then she heard Silas Whitmore's voice from somewhere to her left, easy and carrying. "I'll tell you what the problem is, Harold. Look at the hair." She turned. Whitmore was not a large man, but he had the quality of seeming to take up more space than he occupied. Well-dressed for a frontier town, pleased with himself in the way of a man who was used to being pleased and had stopped noticing it. I was looking at her and Noah, the way she imagined a naturalist might look at a mildly interesting specimen. Curious, slightly contemptuous. "Both of them," he continued, red as October. "You know what they say." She knew what they said. She had heard it her whole life. Red-haired strangers bring ruin wherever they set foot. It was the kind of superstition that thrived in small places, the kind that didn't survive contact with any reasonable person. But reasonable people weren't always who you got. Harold Baines picked up her trunk. For one startled moment she thought he was helping her. Then he threw it. Not far. Just onto the dirt beside the platform steps, where it landed with a sound that made Noah flinch, and two women nearby exchange a look. The carpetbag followed, landing on top of it. Harold didn't look at her when he did it. He turned and walked away, and someone in the crowd actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. More an uncomfortable one. The kind that fills silence because people don't know what else to put there. Evelyn did not move. She stood on the platform in her second-best dress, with her son's hand in hers, and she looked at her luggage in the dirt, and she took one slow breath, and then another. "Mama." Noah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why is everyone looking at us?" "Because they don't know us yet," she said, "and people look at things they don't know." She stepped down off the platform. She picked up the carpetbag. She was reaching for the trunk when she became aware of a shadow falling across it from the other direction, and she looked up. He was not a particularly striking man at first glance. Medium height, broad in the shoulders in the way of someone who worked physically for a living. His hands were visibly calloused, even from a distance, and there was a burn scar curling up his left forearm that had healed but not disappeared. He had dark hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been weathered by sun and by something other than sun. He was not smiling. He was also not looking at her the way anyone else had looked at her since she stepped off that coach. Not with pity, not with curiosity, not with the particular satisfaction of watching someone else's humiliation unfold. He was looking at the trunk. He bent down, picked it up without ceremony, and straightened. "Caleb Mercer," he said. He was not particularly loud about it. "Blacksmith. I've got a house 2 streets over and a spare room I'm not using." He glanced briefly at Noah, then back at her, and there was something in that glance, an acknowledgement maybe, just a registering of the child's presence without any of the calculations she'd been watching everyone else perform. "If you need somewhere to set down while you work out what's next, you're welcome to it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He didn't seem to need her to say anything. He just stood there with her trunk in his hands, patient in the way of a man who was accustomed to waiting for metal to become what he needed it to be. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which she hadn't expected. "Because someone ought to," he said, "and everyone else is standing around waiting for someone else to do it." She looked at her son. Noah was watching Caleb with the careful, measuring look that small children give adults before they decide whether to trust them. A look that is often more accurate than any adult instinct, because children have not yet learned to talk themselves out of what they observe. His name is Noah, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at the boy. Good name, he said, as if this was simply a fact and not a social nicety. He shifted the trunk under his arm. You hungry? I've got bread that isn't terrible. Noah looked up at his mother. She nodded once, and they followed the blacksmith down the street. The spare room was small, clean, and cold, which she could fix with the quilt she'd packed. There was one window facing the side yard, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. It was the most private space she had occupied in 4 months, and she stood in it for a moment after Caleb set the trunk down and told her she could come through to the kitchen when she was ready, and she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known she'd been holding. Noah sat on the edge of the bed and bounced twice experimentally. It squeaks, he reported. Most beds do, she said. Do you think he's nice? She was unpacking the tin box, setting it on the washstand where she could see it. I think he acted decently when no one else did. Is that the same as nice? She considered this. Sometimes it's better. Noah lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He was quiet for a moment, which with him was never nothing. It meant he was processing something, turning it over. Those ladies pulled their kids away from me, he said. Like I was a dog they didn't want them to pet. She stopped what she was doing. She sat on the bed beside him, and she didn't try to pretty it up because he was 6 years old, and he had already lived through enough that he deserved the truth more than he deserved a comfortable lie. Yes, she said. They did. Because of our hair? Partly. And partly because people who don't know what to make of something sometimes act afraid of it instead of curious. He was quiet again. Then, Mr. Caleb didn't act afraid. No, she said. He didn't. She lay down beside him for a moment, the two of them on the narrow bed in the spare room of a man they'd known for 40 minutes, in a town that had made its feelings about them perfectly clear. And she looked at the ceiling and she thought, all right, you don't get to leave. Noah needs a stable floor under him and a roof that isn't moving. You find a way to earn your keep, and you find a way to stay, and you don't let them see you buckle. She was good at not buckling. She'd had practice. Caleb Mercer was a private man, and she learned quickly that privacy with him was not coldness. It was just his natural way of taking up space in the world. He didn't fill silence with talk the way some people did. He worked, and he worked hard, and the evidence of that work was everywhere in the forge that occupied the structure behind his house. Tools hung in precise order, iron stock sorted by gauge, a floor swept clear of debris each morning before the first fire was lit. She came to the kitchen at 6 the first morning and found the coffee already made and a note on the table that said, "Help yourself. No lock on the pantry." That was the kind of man he was. By the second morning, she had figured out enough of the kitchen to make breakfast before he came in from his early work. He stopped in the doorway when he smelled eggs cooking, and his expression went through a small rearrangement she pretended not to notice. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. Noah was already at the table with a piece of yesterday's bread, watching Caleb with that same careful attention. "Do you make swords?" he asked. Caleb poured his coffee. "Not usually. Horseshoes mostly. Tools. Hardware." "Could you make a sword if you wanted to?" A very brief pause. "Probably." Noah considered this with the gravity it deserved. "I think you should want to," he said. Something happened in Caleb's face that wasn't quite a smile but was related to one. He picked up his fork. "I'll think about it," he said. That was the beginning of it. Not a dramatic beginning, not the kind anyone would have noticed from the outside. Just a boy asking a man about swords over a breakfast the woman had made in a house that was starting, almost imperceptibly, to feel less empty. Chats. She did not think about love. She was far too practical for that, and far too recently humiliated to indulge in anything that might make her look foolish again. What she thought about was the problem directly in front of her, which was that she had no money, no plan, and no claim on anyone's goodwill beyond a courtesy that could be withdrawn at any moment. So she worked. She discovered that Caleb's workshop bookkeeping was a disaster, not through carelessness, but through the indifference of a man who was excellent at making things and deeply uninterested in recording what he'd made and what he'd been paid for it. She found a ledger that had been used sporadically for 2 years, entries made in handwriting that got worse as the day went on, whole months missing. She asked permission to organize it. He told her to do whatever she thought was right. She spent 3 evenings rebuilding it from the receipts he kept in a biscuit tin under the workbench. And when she showed him the completed ledger and told him that he had, in the past year, significantly undercharged for ironwork and entirely forgotten to bill one customer 3 separate times, he looked at it for a long moment and then said, "Huh. You're not angry?" she asked. "Why would I be angry?" Some men don't like being told their accounts are wrong. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, a particular directness, undefended in a way that was unusual. "I'm not wrong," he said. "My books were wrong. That's a different thing." She took his books home and kept them from then on, and he paid her for it. A fair wage, not a charity wage. She had made that distinction clear before she accepted, and he had not argued. He did not seem to understand why she'd expected him to. The town made its feelings known in the way towns do. Not in one confrontation, but in 100 small ones, accumulated over days. The dry goods store went suddenly short on the items she needed. The postmaster was slow with her mail. Women she passed on the boardwalk did not cross the street, exactly, but they found reasons to look elsewhere. The children's avoidance of Noah had not lessened. If anything, it had organized itself, which was worse. Instead of random wariness, it had become deliberate. She watched her son walk home from the spot she'd found for him to sit and watch the other children play, because she had not yet found a school that would take him, and she watched how carefully he held himself. He never cried in front of her. She knew he cried alone sometimes at night, because she could hear it through the thin wall. She didn't go in. She had learned, with Noah, that going in made him ashamed, and shame was worse than grief. Instead, she would lie in her own bed and press her hand flat against the wall until she heard him go quiet. What she had not anticipated was Silas Whitmore. She had registered the man at the station as the type to make trouble, but she'd assumed the trouble would be incidental. The offhand comments, the superstition mongering, the social machinery that men like him kept running without much specific effort. She had not anticipated that the trouble would be directed, that it would be organized. She found out about it the way she found out about most things, by listening carefully and not appearing to listen at all. It was the hardware supplier, a man named Dale Prentice, who seemed to feel obscure guilt about various aspects of his life, and occasionally expressed this guilt by being slightly more honest than was necessary. He came to collect payment for a stock delivery, and while Caleb was inside getting the cash, Prentice stood in the yard and shifted his weight several times before saying, as if he'd been holding it and simply couldn't anymore, "You know Whitmore's been talking to your customers." Evelyn was sorting iron rod by length, and she did not stop. "I wasn't aware of that. What's he saying?" "That the forge has gotten unreliable since—" He stopped. "Since the red-haired woman moved in?" Prentice had the decency to look uncomfortable. "More or less." "And people believe him?" "He's Whitmore." Prentice seemed to feel this was sufficient explanation, and it was, which was a depressing fact about the kind of town Dry Creek was. "He's got his hand in most of the local supply chains. He makes a suggestion, and people listen, whether they mean to or not." Evelyn set down the iron rods. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've got daughters," he said, after a moment. "And if either of them ever needed help, and some man in a position to give it decided not to because of what other people thought—" He left it there, which was probably as far as he could go without saying something that committed him to an action he wasn't ready to take. "Thank you, Mr. Prentice," she said. He nodded, took his payment from Caleb when it came, and left quickly, like a man who had done a good thing before he could talk himself out of it, and wanted to be gone before he reconsidered. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of his qualities she was coming to count on. The patience, the absence of the urge to fill her sentences with his own. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I knew business had dropped," he said. "I thought it was just—" He stopped. "You thought maybe they were right about us," she said. Not cruelly, just as a fact. He looked at her directly. "No," he said. "I thought maybe I was wrong to have brought you here, that it was making things harder for you instead of easier." The difference between those two things was significant, and she felt it. "It made things possible," she said. "There's a difference." "Whitmore's been wanting this building for 3 years," Caleb said. "He wanted it before you came. The excuses change, the wanting doesn't." She had worked that out already, but hearing him say it organized something for her. So this isn't about us. It's partly about you. He saw an opportunity. He looked at the ledger, which was sitting open on the table. But the thing about Whitmore is that he leaves tracks. He's been doing this long enough that he's gotten careless about it. He doesn't think anyone's keeping records. Evelyn looked at the ledger too. Then she thought about the biscuit tin under the workbench, the years of loose receipts, the patterns that had emerged when she'd assembled them. Then we should start, she said. We should start what? Keeping records, she said, of everything. He looked at her. You think that helps? I think eventually it does, she said. I think men like Whitmore make mistakes when they feel safe, and they feel safe when they believe no one is watching. So you watch, you write it down, you wait. It was not a dramatic plan. It had no immediate relief in it. But Caleb looked at her with the expression he got when something had been said that matched what he actually thought about the world, and he nodded once. Then we watch, he said. Noah found the first piece by accident. That was always how it would be remembered, that a 6-year-old boy, wandering out to look at the stars from behind the woodpile because he couldn't sleep, had overheard 2 of Whitmore's men talking where they thought no one could hear. He had not understood most of it, but he had understood the word fire, and he had understood the name Mercer, which was Caleb's name and was now, in Noah's head, beginning to feel like his own name, though he hadn't said so out loud yet. He came inside and sat on Evelyn's bed in the dark, and she startled awake, and he told her what he'd heard. Her first instinct was to tell him he'd misunderstood. Children mishear, children misassemble fragments of adult conversation into things that mean something other than what was actually said. But she looked at her son's face in the dark, the set of his jaw, the held-still quality of him, the way his hands were folded in his lap like he was trying very hard not to be a child right now. And she did not dismiss it. What exactly did they say? She asked. He told her again, slowly, carefully, in the order he'd heard it. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she sat with it for a moment. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to knock on Caleb's door. He opened it in 30 seconds, which told her he'd been awake. Something's going to happen to the forge, she said. Soon. Tonight, maybe. He looked at her, then at Noah, who had followed her and was standing in the hallway in his nightshirt looking determined. Caleb read the situation in a single glance, not panicking, not dismissing, just taking in the information and adjusting to it the way a craftsman adjusts to an unexpected property of the material in front of him. Tell me what he heard, he said. Noah told him. He told it the same way he told Evelyn, with the same careful exactness. When the boy was done, Caleb crouched down so he was at eye level. You sure about the word fire? He said. Noah looked at him steadily. I'm sure. Caleb nodded. He stood up. Right, he said. Then we've got work to do. He did not waste time on whether to believe a child. He did not need to qualify it or hedge it or consider whether a 6-year-old's testimony was reliable enough to act on. He simply moved, and Evelyn thought in that moment that this was one of the most significant things she had learned about him in the weeks she'd been here. That he took people seriously at their stated size, not the size he'd decided they probably were. She thought, whatever else happens, I have not misjudged this man. And then the night moved fast, and what they found was worse than they'd expected. And the morning came with smoke and accusations and a town ready to believe the worst. And 6-year-old Noah, standing in the middle of it, already holding the thread that would unravel everything. But that is the next part of the story, and it has not happened yet. For now, it was still the night before. And for one quiet hour, the 3 of them sat in Caleb's kitchen with coffee and milk and the lamp burning low, checking every window, listening to the dark, and waiting together the way people wait when they have decided, without announcing it and without ceremony, that whatever comes next, they are going to face it as one. The night passed without fire. That was the first surprise. Caleb had moved his most valuable stock inside, the finished ironwork, the tools that had taken the longest to make, the ledger Evelyn had rebuilt from scratch, and the 3 of them had kept irregular watch until the sky began to lighten, taking turns dozing in the kitchen chairs while the others listened. Noah had fallen asleep at the table around 2 in the morning, his head on his folded arms, and neither of them had moved him. By the time the sun was fully up and nothing had happened, Evelyn felt the particular exhaustion of a fear that had been fully prepared for and then had nowhere to go. She made coffee. Caleb went out to check the forge and came back saying everything was where he'd left it. Noah woke up with a crease from his sleeve printed across his cheek and looked immediately at the window. "Did anything happen?" he asked. "Not yet," Caleb said. "Not yet." She noticed he didn't say no. She noticed he also didn't tell the boy he'd been wrong. The morning ran its ordinary course. Caleb lit the forge, she started bread. Noah ate his breakfast and went to sit on the back steps with his wooden horse, moving it through some private story she couldn't follow from the kitchen window. The sun rose higher and the town made its usual sounds, and nothing came. But the feeling didn't leave. It just went quiet and watchful, the way a dog goes quiet when it hears something outside the house that the people inside can't hear yet. She had learned, in the weeks since arriving in Dry Creek, to trust that feeling. What she had not anticipated was the shape the cruelty would take with Noah. She had expected the adults to continue their particular version of it, the avoidance, the absent courtesy, the studied indifference that was worse in some ways than open hostility because it offered nothing to push against. She had calibrated herself for that. What she had not calibrated for was the organized cruelty of children, which was its own category, meaner in its precision and more inventive in its application. It started with the schoolyard. She had finally secured a place for Noah at the town's single school, after 3 visits to the school teacher, a thin, precise woman named Mrs. Alderman, who had, to her credit, not cited the hair or the rumors when she initially declined, but had cited capacity, which was demonstrably false since there were 14 children in a room built for 25. Evelyn had made the math clear, quietly, the 3rd time she came, and Mrs. Alderman had relented with the air of a woman making a concession she expected to regret. Noah had gone on a Monday with his slate and a lunch she'd packed carefully. He had come home on Monday with a bruised shin and the careful composure of someone who had decided not to say what had happened. She had not pushed. She packed his lunch again on Tuesday. He went back. By Thursday, she knew about the names. He hadn't told her. She'd heard it from across the fence when he didn't know she was there, 2 boys calling after him as he walked home. Rusthead, Witch Boy. She had stood behind the fence post and pressed her palm flat against the wood and breathed until the worst of it passed, because going out there would have made it worse for him, and he needed to learn to walk through it, but she stood there until he was past them and out of earshot, and then she went inside and stood over the washbowl for a moment before she was ready to start dinner. Caleb came in that evening and looked at her once and said, "What happened?" "Nothing I didn't expect," she said. He let that sit for a moment. "That's not the same as it being all right." "No," she said. "It's not." He sat down at the table. He had a habit of rubbing the scar on his left forearm when he was thinking, not anxiously, just absently, the way you might touch a scar that has long since stopped hurting, but whose texture is familiar. She had noticed it enough times to recognize it as the signal that he was working something out. "I could talk to someone," he said. "Please don't," she said immediately. "If he thinks I'm fighting his battles for him, it will be worse. He has to know he can walk through it himself." Caleb looked at her. "And you? Can you walk through it yourself?" The question was direct enough that it caught her off guard, which didn't happen often. She turned back to the stove. "I've been walking through things by myself for a long time." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I've got right now." He didn't push. She was grateful for that. He also didn't pretend she'd answered, which she was more grateful for. The rumors moved through Dry Creek the way rumors always do, not in one direction, but in all of them simultaneously, finding the paths of least resistance, which in any town are the paths where people already want to believe the thing being said. Silas Whitmore was too practiced to spread things himself. He had a network for it, not a formal one, nothing that could be traced back cleanly, but a social infrastructure of wives and suppliers and men who owed him favors and women who depended on his goodwill for their family's income. The current version, which Evelyn heard from Dale Prentice's wife Marjorie, who told her in the apologetic, rushed tone of someone delivering bad news they feel obligated to deliver, was that Evelyn had left a previous town under suspicion of deception, that she had claimed widowhood falsely, that Noah's father was alive somewhere, possibly in prison, that Caleb, decent man, had been taken in by a practiced liar. She sat with Marjorie's discomfort for a moment after hearing it. "And what do you think?" Evelyn asked. Marjorie, who was not a bad woman, just a cautious one, the kind of caution that comes from years of learning what it costs to be wrong in public, said, "I think you work hard and you seem honest, and you've done nothing I can point to." But? But Silas Whitmore has done a lot for this town. And people have long memories for that, even when they should be asking what he got in return. She set down her cup. "I thought you should know what's being said, so you're not walking into it blind." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I'm not blind." What she was, going home, was angry. She had been managing a careful, patient approach. Keep records, wait, don't give him anything to use. And it was the right approach, and she knew it was the right approach. But knowing the right approach and not wanting to throw something through a window were not mutually exclusive. And she walked home fast with her hands in her pockets and her jaw set, and she did not let herself think about it too directly until she was through Caleb's front door with it closed behind her. Noah was in the forge. She could hear him through the back wall, his voice and Caleb's in the comfortable back and forth of a lesson. She'd noticed over the past 2 weeks that Caleb had started letting the boy watch him work, then started explaining what he was doing as he did it, then started asking Noah to hand him tools by name, which meant the boy had to learn the names first. Noah had taken to this with an intensity that surprised her. He would lie awake running through them at night. She'd heard him through the wall doing it, whispering, "Fuller, Swage, Hardy, Punch." She stood in the kitchen and listened to the two of them for a moment, and the worst of the anger drained out of her, not because anything had changed, but because there was something in that sound. A child's voice, earnest and concentrated, and a man's voice, patient and even, that reminded her of the actual shape of what she was fighting for. She put the kettle on. The supplies started disappearing 10 days later. The first time Caleb thought he'd miscounted. He went to the stock he kept in the secondary shed, iron rod mostly, and a quantity of sheet steel for a door hinge order he was behind on. And the count was short by an amount he might have attributed to error if the amount hadn't been so specific. You don't accidentally miscount 17 pounds of rod. He didn't say anything to Evelyn that first time. She knew anyway. She kept the ledger, and she reconciled the stock count against it every week. So when she sat down on Friday and the numbers didn't match, she asked him directly. He confirmed what she'd already worked out. "Someone's taking it," she said. "I can't prove that yet." "You can't prove it yet," she agreed. "So we build proof." She opened the ledger to a new page. "From tonight, we count everything. Every morning, every weight. Everything that comes in and everything that goes out gets written down the day it moves. If it disappears again, we have a baseline to measure against." He looked at the new page. "You think they'll try again?" "I think they're testing us," she said, "to see if we notice, to see if we do anything about it." She wrote the date at the top of the page, neat and deliberate. "We notice. We do something about it." What they did was careful and unglamorous, the way most useful things are. Every morning before the forge was lit, Caleb counted stock and Evelyn recorded it. Every material that entered or left was logged with date, quantity, and customer name, where applicable. She started a second book for the purpose and kept it separate from the main ledger, in the tin under the workbench, because she had learned from the biscuit tin that Caleb's instinct toward preservation, just keep it, you never know, was one of his better habits, and she intended to formalize it. The second disappearance happened 11 days later, smaller, more precise. Whoever was doing it was intelligent enough not to be greedy, just enough to matter, not so much that it couldn't be explained away. But she had the baseline now, and the numbers didn't lie, and she wrote it down and dated it and put the book back in the tin. 2 incidents, she said that evening. Caleb was cleaning his tools, which he did every evening with the focused attention of someone who understood that maintenance was a form of respect for the work. "You think there'll be a third?" "Before they try something larger, yes. They're establishing a pattern. They want it to look like incompetence, like you're running a forge that can't keep track of its own inventory." She folded her hands. "If they can make you look incompetent, it's easier to make the case that the business is failing. And if the business appears to be failing, it's easier for Whitmore to step in with an offer." Caleb set down the rasp he'd been cleaning. "He's made offers before. 3 times since I've owned this place. Every time I've turned him down. And every time, what happened afterward?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something went wrong, lost orders, a supplier who went suddenly short, a rumor." He looked at her. "I never connected them." "You didn't have anyone keeping records," she said. It wasn't a criticism. just a fact. He took it as such. I didn't, he said. She thought about the pattern as she walked to the window and looked out at the yard, where the last light was leaving the sky in long horizontal streaks of orange and dark. 3 attempts over how many years, each one targeted at a moment of vulnerability, each one plausibly deniable. And now a 4th, with a more specific object, not just the business, but the family inside it. He's escalating, she said. He has a timeline. What does that mean? She turned from the window. It means whatever he's planning to do, he wants to do it soon. He wouldn't be moving this fast if he had time to be patient. She thought of Marjorie Prentice's careful apology, the rumors already circulating, the organized social pressure. He's decided the window is now, while we're new and off balance. Then we need to not be off balance, Caleb said. We're not, she said. He just doesn't know that yet. The painted words appeared on a Saturday morning. Cursed family. Done in red paint, rough letters, across the front of the workshop wall facing the main street. Not small. Meant to be seen. Caleb discovered it when he went out to open the forge. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he went back inside and told Evelyn, and she came out and looked at it without saying anything for a moment. Noah, who had followed her out, stood beside her and looked at it too. He read slowly. He was still working on his letters. And she watched the words register in his face. Someone painted that, he said. Yes, she said. Because of us? She crouched down beside him. It was the thing she never knew how to manage. The balance between protecting him from what was ugly and preparing him for the fact that ugly things existed and would come at them anyway. Because someone wants us to go away, she said, and they're trying to frighten us. Are we frightened? She looked at the paint, red on weathered gray wood, meant to wound. She thought of 800 miles in a stagecoach. She thought of the trunk in the dirt. She thought of her hand flat against the wall in the dark, while her son cried on the other side of it. We're not going anywhere, she said. Caleb had gone to the shed and come back with a brush and a bucket of whitewash. He was painting over the letters with methodical strokes before most of the street was awake enough to see. She watched him work. Not frantically, not with obvious anger, just steadily, covering it over until the wall was white and the words were gone. You should leave it, she said. Let people see it. Let them see who did this. He paused in his work. I can't prove who did it. You don't have to prove it today. But if you whitewash it, it disappears. If you leave it, it's evidence. He looked at the wall, at the brush in his hand. Evidence of what exactly? Someone painted a wall. Evidence of a pattern, she said. It goes in the book. He stood there for a moment, then he set the brush down. He went inside and she heard him a minute later moving around, and he came back with a paper and a pencil, and he wrote down the date, the approximate time he'd found it, the paint color, the placement. He handed it to her and she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Then he picked up the brush and finished whitewashing the wall. It was a compromise. Not perfect. But she was learning that what she and Caleb did together was mostly make the best of imperfect choices, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which was its own form of honesty. The horses were spooked 3 days after that. Caleb kept 2 horses, a working animal and the older mare he'd had for years, who was mostly retired but which he fed out of loyalty and which followed him around the paddock with the devoted, slow attention of an elderly companion who has forgotten that horses are not people. Someone got into the paddock in the night and frightened them badly. She didn't know how, and Caleb said the signs suggested fireworks or something similar, close enough to spook, but not close enough to injure. When he went out at first light, the gate was open and both horses were at the far end of the paddock, pressed against the fence in the particular miserable posture of horses that have been badly frightened. The old mare was lame. Not seriously, she would recover, but her right foreleg was swollen from where she'd hit it against the fence post in the dark. Caleb stood with her for a long time that morning, running his hand along her leg, checking. His face was very still in the way it got when he was holding something inside that he wasn't going to let out where anyone could see it. Evelyn stayed back and let him have it. Noah, who had come out behind her, stood at a careful distance and watched Caleb with the horse, and she saw something in the boy's face that she recognized as understanding. The specific understanding of watching someone care for something they're afraid of losing. Will she be all right? Noah asked, quietly, so as not to disturb them. Yes, Evelyn said. She'll need rest. Noah was quiet for a moment. Then, "He loves that horse." "He does." "Whoever did that knew he would." Noah frowned at the paddock. "They did it to hurt him specifically, not just because horses were there." She looked at her son. 6 years old, standing in the early morning light in his two big boots, working out the shape of a cruelty, with the same careful logic he applied to everything. She thought, "You see too much for your age, and I don't know if that's something to be glad about." "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." He nodded, processing it. "We should write that down too," he said, "in the book." She had told him about the book a week ago, explaining in simple terms that they were keeping records because records were how you proved what had happened when someone later tried to say it hadn't. He had listened to this seriously and asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and then had said, without drama, "Good, because I'm going to remember everything." She looked at him standing there. She thought, "You already are." The lost orders started the week after. 3 customers canceled in 5 days, 2 who gave no reason at all, and 1 who said, apologetically, uncomfortably, that he decided to use a smith in the next town over, said it in a way that communicated clearly that the decision had not been made freely. Caleb heard this without visible reaction, thanked the man for letting him know, and came inside and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a while. Evelyn put coffee in front of him. She sat down across from him. "Tell me about the 3 orders," she said. He told her. She wrote it down. Dates, names, what had been ordered, what reason was given or not given. "That's 15% of this month's projected income," she said when she'd finished the arithmetic. "I know. If it continues at this rate, I know, Evelyn." She set the pencil down. "I'm not telling you things you don't know. I'm saying them out loud because that's how we look at it clearly, instead of just feeling it." He looked at her. "I know that too." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I've been alone a long time. I'm used to keeping things in my own head." "You're not alone now." It came out more directly than she'd intended. She heard it land, watched him hear it, and neither of them looked away. "No," he said, "I'm not." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she kept noticing about silence with Caleb. It was not awkward the way silence could be with people who were still performing for each other. It was just quiet. The ordinary quiet of 2 people sitting in a kitchen after an honest sentence. "I received a letter today," she said, which was the other thing she'd been carrying since morning. She put it on the table. "The return address is Whitmore's office." He looked at it, but didn't touch it. "What does it say?" "It's an offer, framed as a proposal. He would purchase the forge and the property at what he describes as fair market value. He's given me 30 days to consider it." "He addressed it to you?" "He addressed it to me." She held his gaze. "Not to you, to me, which tells you exactly what kind of pressure this is supposed to be." Caleb looked at the envelope. Something moved through his face. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more considered than anger. "He thinks you'll persuade me. He thinks I'll want to leave badly enough to try." She picked the letter back up. "He doesn't know me." "No," Caleb said. "He doesn't." She put the letter in the tin with the other records. She wrote the date and the address and a summary of the contents in the notebook. Caleb watched her do it, and she heard something in his breathing shift. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of tension that loosens slightly when a person realizes they are not carrying a weight alone. Outside, Noah had gotten Caleb's barn cat to sit on his lap, which the cat did for no one, and he was explaining something to it in the serious, one-sided tones of a child delivering important information. Evelyn could not hear the words, but she could see him through the window, and something about the ordinary persistence of him, sitting in the yard talking to a cat after the morning they'd all just had, made her press her hand briefly flat on the table, the way she pressed it on the wall at night, grounding herself in something solid. She would not leave Dry Creek, not because she had nowhere to go, and not because she owed Caleb anything beyond what she was already giving. She would not leave because Silas Whitmore had decided, from the moment he saw her step off that stagecoach, that she was the kind of person who could be moved, that she was the kind of woman, with a small child and no money and no connections, who would go when enough pressure was applied. She intended to demonstrate that he was wrong about that. She would demonstrate it the way she demonstrated everything, methodically, patiently, with good records and a level head and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had packed her life into a trunk and crossed 800 miles and had long ago run out of places to run to. The fire, when it finally came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks later. And it came because Silas Whitmore had made the mistake that men like him always eventually make. The mistake of believing that because something is working, you should do more of it. That escalation is the same as strength, that a person who hasn't broken yet simply needs a bigger blow. He had not accounted for Noah being awake. He had not accounted for a 6-year-old boy who had been told that noticing things mattered, who had taken that instruction with complete seriousness, who slept lightly and remembered everything and was not, despite what the people of Dry Creek had decided about him from a distance, the least bit cursed. He was, in fact, the most observant person in that household, and possibly in that town, and what he saw on the night of the fire, before the fire, in the hour that preceded it, was going to matter very much before this was over. But the fire came first, and the accusations came with the morning, and Evelyn stood in the street with smoke still in her hair, and Silas Whitmore pointing his finger and the whole town watching, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Dry Creek, she felt the ground move under her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. It was the feeling of a trap closing, and her son was the only one who knew how to open it. The fire started in the northeast corner of the forge, where Caleb stored his charcoal supply. That was the detail that mattered, though Evelyn didn't know it mattered yet when she woke to the smell of smoke at 2:30 in the morning. She woke the way she always woke to trouble, fast, completely, no gradual surfacing. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully conscious of deciding to move, and what she saw in the yard made her stomach drop through the floor. The forge wall was orange, not fully burning, not yet, but the light behind the boards was wrong. That particular wrong color that means something is on fire on the other side. She was out the bedroom door in 4 steps, already calling Caleb's name, and he was already in the hallway because he'd smelled it too, and he was faster out of sleep than she was. They went through the house together without wasted motion, and she heard Noah's door open behind her and said without turning, "Stay inside," in a voice that left no room for argument, and for once he listened. Caleb had a rain barrel at the back corner of the house and another beside the paddock, and he went for both simultaneously in the way of a man who has thought about fire before, who has run the scenario in his head because he works with heat every day and knows what it costs. She helped him carry, and they worked until her arms ached, and her hair was full of smoke, and the orange behind the boards had gone from bright to dull to gone. And what remained was a charred corner of the northeast wall and the smell of wet ash, and the particular silence that follows a thing that was almost much worse. She sat down in the yard afterward because her legs told her to. Caleb sat beside her. They were both filthy. The sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of morning. "The charcoal," he said. "It started there?" "That corner, yes. Charcoal doesn't just catch on its own." He looked at his hands. "Someone said it." She had known that since she smelled the smoke, but hearing him say it made it real in a different way. She looked at the blackened wall. How long until it would have spread to the rest of the structure? Maybe another hour, 2 if the wind stayed down. So whoever said it left enough time to be somewhere else. Yes. She was very tired. She was also very clear in her head, which was a combination she'd learned to work with. The particular clarity that comes when you're past the point of being frightened and have moved into something flatter and more functional. "We need to document the corner before anyone touches it," she said. "The point of origin. Everything we can observe about how it burned." "Evelyn, it's 3 in the morning. I know what time it is." She pushed herself to her feet. "I also know that by 7 o'clock this town is going to have a story about this fire, and I want us to have written down the truth before someone else decides what the truth is." He looked at her for a moment, then he got up. They spent an hour in the ash and the dark, Caleb describing and Evelyn writing by lantern light, where the char was deepest, the angle of the burn on the wall boards, the absence of any accelerant they could identify by smell in the other areas of the forge, the northeast corner's specific characteristics. She drew a rough diagram with compass directions. She noted the time they'd woken and what they'd observed in sequence. She noted that the charcoal supply had been approximately 40 pounds, recently delivered, and that the delivery was recorded in the ledger. When she was done, she had 5 pages of handwritten notes in the lamplight, her handwriting smaller and more cramped than usual from the cold and the exhaustion. "This is good," Caleb said, reading over it. This is necessary, she said. Whether it's good depends on what comes next. What came next arrived with the morning. Silas Whitmore came at 7:45, and he did not come alone. He brought the sheriff, a man named Roy Calhoun, who had the quality of someone permanently in the middle of two things he didn't want to be between, and who had, to Evelyn's observation over the past months, consistently resolved that position in Whitmore's direction whenever resolution was required. He also brought two men she recognized as regular fixtures in Whitmore's orbit, and a third man she didn't know who carried himself like someone who had been told what to say and was rehearsing it. They came to the front of the house, not the forge, which told her the performance was meant for the street as much as for them. Caleb opened the door before they knocked. "Whitmore," he said. "Caleb." Whitmore looked past him, found Evelyn in the hallway, and let his gaze settle on her with the comfortable weight of a man who has already decided how this conversation ends. "I heard you had some trouble in the night." "Fire in the forge," Caleb said. "We put it out." "Terrible thing. These accidents." Whitmore shook his head in a way that was meant to convey regret, and conveyed instead a very precise form of satisfaction. "Though I suppose when people don't take proper care of their equipment, it wasn't an accident," Caleb said. A pause. Whitmore's expression did not change, which was itself interesting. A man who had just been told an accident was not an accident should register some surprise, and the absence of it meant he was managing his face. "Well," he said, "that's a serious claim." "Roy," Caleb looked at the sheriff. "The charcoal store in the northeast corner burned. Charcoal doesn't self-ignite. I need someone to look at the burn pattern." Calhoun looked uncomfortable, which was his default state in Caleb's presence since the recent months had given him more and more occasions to choose between what was right and what was easy. "I can have someone come by," he started. "Actually," Whitmore said, in the pleasant tone of a man redirecting a conversation he's been waiting to redirect, "there's something else we need to discuss. I've had a report," and here he paused, letting the word sit, letting everyone feel the weight of it, "from a witness, regarding what was seen near the forge earlier in the evening." Evelyn did not move. She was standing in the hallway with her hands at her sides, and she made sure nothing showed on her face. "A witness," Caleb said flatly. "A reliable witness." Whitmore glanced at the third man, the one she didn't recognize. "Tom Briggs here was passing by around 9 o'clock last night and saw something that concerned him." Tom Briggs was maybe 35, with the face of a man who had made a number of poor decisions and had learned to live with them, and then had made one more. He looked at Evelyn and then looked away. "I saw the woman," he said, "going into the forge with a lamp when the blacksmith wasn't there." The street was not empty. It was barely 8 in the morning, and Dry Creek was already awake and already watching, the way small towns are always watching anything that happens on their main street, and she was aware of heads turning, of the specific quality of attention that rumors produce in an audience that is already primed. "He's lying," Caleb said. He said it without heat, just as a fact. "Now, Caleb," Calhoun started. "He is lying. Evelyn was in the house, I was in the house. We both woke to the smell of smoke at approximately 2:30. That's when we discovered the fire, already burning." "There's no one to confirm that," Whitmore said, "except her." "There's me," said a voice from behind them. Everyone turned. Noah was in the hallway, still in his nightshirt, his red hair disordered from sleep, his face carrying the expression of someone who has been listening from the top of the stairs and has decided that listening is no longer enough. He looked at Tom Briggs with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a child who does not yet know he is supposed to be afraid of men like Tom Briggs. "Noah," Evelyn said quietly. "I heard you tell me to stay inside," he said. "I didn't go outside. But I heard everything from my room. Mama and Mr. Caleb were in the house. I heard them wake up. I heard them go out." He looked at Whitmore. "I heard them come back in too, when the fire was out." Whitmore looked at the boy. Something passed through his face, not discomfort exactly, but a brief recalculation. "A child's testimony," he said, turning to Calhoun. "A child who was there," Evelyn said. She stepped forward past Caleb into the doorway so she was in the full light. "My son is 6 years old and he tells the truth. And I would like to know, Sheriff, whether you intend to investigate who actually set that fire, or whether you intend to proceed on the word of a man I have never met who was standing next to Silas Whitmore. Calhoun opened his mouth, closed it. "I'll look at the burn pattern," he said finally. It cost him something to say it, which was the most honest thing she'd seen him do. "This afternoon." "This morning," she said, "before anything else disturbs the site." Another long pause. "This morning," he said. Whitmore's mouth tightened at the corners. It was the only sign of displeasure he showed before he rearranged his face into something more neutral and said, "Of course, Roy, do what you need to do," in the tone of a man graciously allowing something he cannot prevent, which was a skilled performance, and she gave him credit for it even as she noted it for the record. They left. The street began to look elsewhere. Caleb closed the door. Noah was still standing in the hallway. "You were supposed to stay inside," Evelyn said. "I did stay inside," he said. "The door was open." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the specific expression of a child who believes, correctly, that he has just done something important and is checking to see if the adults have noticed. She did not let herself smile, because this was not the moment for smiling, but it took some effort. "Go put your clothes on," she said. He went. Calhoun came at 9 and looked at the burn pattern in the northeast corner with a careful attention that she suspected he hadn't applied to anything involving Caleb's property in some time. He had a deputy with him, a younger man named Sutter, who seemed genuinely interested in what he was looking at and who crouched down in the ash and examined the char marks without the fidgeting discomfort of his superior. "It burned from the outside in," Sutter said, straightening. "The deepest char is on the exterior face of the boards, not the interior." Calhoun looked at this. "What does that mean exactly?" "Means the fire started outside the building and burned inward," Sutter said. He glanced at Caleb. "Someone put something against the exterior wall, in the gap between the wall and the charcoal store." Evelyn handed Calhoun the notes she'd written the night before. He took them without comment and read through them, and she watched his eyes move down the pages, the diagram, the observations, the timestamps. And she watched something in his face shift from the prepared neutrality he'd arrived with towards something more genuine. "You wrote this last night?" he said. "At approximately 3:30 in the morning, while the site was undisturbed." He looked at the pages again, then at the burn corner, then at his deputy. Sutter was already nodding slightly, which meant he was reaching the same place. "I'll need to speak to Tom Briggs again," Calhoun said finally. "I'd like to know who Briggs knows," Caleb said. "What his connection is to the property dispute." "I'll look into it." Calhoun folded the notes carefully. "Can I keep these?" "You may have copies," Evelyn said. "I'll make them this afternoon. The originals stay with us." He accepted this without argument, which was progress of a kind. He left with his deputy, and the quality of the morning changed slightly. Not resolved, not safe, but marginally less precarious. The way a road that was becoming a cliff edge levels off for a stretch before you can assess whether it levels off again. The copies she made that afternoon took 2 hours, and when she finished she had a clear, fair copy of everything: the fire notes, the disappearing stock records, the canceled orders, the date and detail of the painted wall, the letter from Whitmore's office, every piece of the accumulated record she'd been building since she understood what they were dealing with. She organized it in sequence and tied it with string and put it in a separate location from the tin, the third place, behind the loose board in the kitchen wall that she'd found when she was cleaning and had said nothing about, because a loose board behind a kitchen wall is exactly the kind of place a systematic man like Whitmore would never think to look. She was tying the string when Noah came and sat at the table and watched her. "What are those?" he asked. "Everything we've written down since I started keeping records." He absorbed this. "Is it enough?" "I don't know yet." She finished the knot. "Possibly enough to make Calhoun ask questions he's been avoiding. Not yet enough for what we'd really need." "What would we really need?" She looked at her son. He had a smear of ash on his forehead from playing near the blackened forge wall, which she had told him twice to stay away from, which meant she would have to tell him a third time. She thought about how to explain this to a 6-year-old and then decided to explain it the way she would to anyone, because experience had taught her he usually kept up. "We would need something that shows the pattern," she said. "Not just what's happened to us, but what happened before us. How many other people Whitmore has done this to? Because right now we're one complaint, and one complaint can be managed. But if other people have records—" She stopped. They probably don't, Noah said. No, she said, probably not. Because he picked people who wouldn't. She looked at him again, harder this time. What do you mean? He frowned at the table, working through it. He picked people who had something wrong with them already, like us. We came with problems he could point to. The red hair, the letters, the money. He picked that on purpose. Because if something bad happens to people who already have something against them, everyone thinks the bad thing is their fault. He looked up. So they don't keep records. Because keeping records means you think someone will listen, and if you already know no one will listen, why write it down? The kitchen was very quiet. She said carefully, "Where did you learn to think like that?" He shrugged, the universal shrug of a child who doesn't know where they learned something and experiences the question as irrelevant. "It just seems obvious," he said. She sat with that for a moment. It was obvious, in the way that things are obvious once someone has said them, and then you cannot understand why they weren't obvious before. Whitmore didn't just pick vulnerable targets because they were easier. He picked them because their vulnerability became the explanation. People who are already considered failures don't get believed when they report being failed. She had been building a record, but she had been building a record of what had happened to them. What she needed was a record of what had happened to everyone. She sat down across from her son. "Noah, do you remember the night a few weeks ago when you couldn't sleep and you went outside?" He looked at her carefully. "Yes." "You said you heard men near Whitmore's warehouse. You said you saw them unloading iron with the stamp," he said, "the M in the circle, like on Mr. Caleb's finished pieces." "Yes?" She kept her voice level because she didn't want to weight this with her own urgency and make him feel the need to embellish or confirm more than he'd actually seen. "I want you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Not just what you told me before. Everything, the order of things, what they looked like, where exactly you were standing, everything you can remember." He told her. He told her for 20 minutes, and it was not the summary version he'd given her in the dark at 2 in the morning while still half asleep. It was the full version, unfolded slowly and carefully in the sequence he'd experienced it, and what it contained was this. 2 men he didn't recognize, a flatbed wagon with a canvas cover, ironwork that bore Caleb's maker's mark being transferred from the wagon into Whitmore's secondary warehouse. Not the main storefront, the secondary building behind it on the alley, the one with the repainted door. He had stood behind the corner of the fence for what he thought was about 10 minutes. One of the men had said something about getting the stock moved before anyone came by in the morning. The other had used a name, Mr. White, which was clearly a truncation he'd heard people use for Whitmore. And then Noah had heard a sound from the street and been frightened and slipped back toward the house. When he finished, she was very still. "The secondary warehouse," she said. "You're sure?" "The one with the new door. Red. It used to be brown." He nodded. "I noticed because I thought it was an odd color for a warehouse." She stood up. She went to the window. She looked out at the yard, at the blackened corner of the forge, at the paddock where the old mare was moving slowly but moving. Caleb's stolen iron. In Whitmore's secondary warehouse. If it was still there, and it might not be, it had been weeks, there was no reason to assume it was still there. But if it was still there, that was not just evidence of theft. That was evidence with a maker's mark on it. That was physical proof of a specific crime that could be dated and traced and placed in the hands of someone who could not ignore it. She heard Caleb come in from the yard. She turned. "I need to tell you something," she said. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without filling her pauses. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's had that material for weeks," Caleb said. "I know." "He could have moved it, sold it, melted it down." "He could have," she agreed. "But you said yourself he's gotten careless. He's been doing this long enough that he doesn't think about exposure. He doesn't think anyone is looking carefully enough." She looked at him. "Is the maker's mark deeply struck on all your finished pieces?" "Stamps a 1/4 inch deep on anything going to a customer. I've done it the same way for 12 years. "Then if it's there, it's identifiable." She leaned her hands on the table. "We need to see what's in that warehouse." Caleb looked at her. "You know we can't break into Whitmore's property." "I'm not suggesting we break in," she said. "I'm suggesting we find someone with the legal standing to look. Someone Whitmore can't redirect." "Calhoun." Caleb said the name flat, without much faith in it. "Calhoun is scared of Whitmore, but he's not entirely without conscience. We showed him that this morning." She thought about the way the sheriff had read her notes, the shift in his face. If we give him specific information, the location, the description, the connection to the fire, he has enough for a reason to look. And if he looks and finds Caleb Mercer's maker's mark on iron in Silas Whitmore's secondary warehouse, then it's not one complaint anymore, Caleb said slowly. It's the beginning of something he can't explain away. He was quiet for another moment. Calhoun will tell Whitmore we're looking. Maybe. But once a lawman knows something, the thing is known. He can't unknow it. She straightened. And we have the copies. Everything. Even if Whitmore moves the iron before Calhoun gets there, we have the date of Noah's account, recorded separately from tonight, filed before this conversation happened. She touched the pocket where she'd put the folded copy she'd made to give to Calhoun. We anticipated this. We wrote it down. Caleb looked at her. There was something in his face she had seen before. That particular expression that was not admiration exactly, but was the recognition of a person who thinks clearly under pressure and values that quality above most others. You've been building toward this, he said. I've been building a record, she said. I didn't know what it would be used for. I just knew it needed to exist. He nodded once. Then he reached for his coat. I'll go see Calhoun, he said. We'll both go, she said. He looked at her. He needs to see that I'm not hiding, she said. Every time I'm in front of him, I'm not the person Whitmore described. That matters. It accumulates. He held the coat for a moment. And Noah? She raised her voice slightly. Noah. His head appeared around the doorframe with the speed of a child who was not, in fact, in the other room but immediately adjacent to this conversation. Mrs. Alderman's house is 2 streets over, Evelyn said. You're going to go sit on her porch until we get back. You'll take your reading book. I don't want to go to Mrs. Alderman's. I know. He looked at her face and read it accurately. Is it dangerous? He asked. Where you're going? We're going to the sheriff's office, she said, in broad daylight. He considered this, working out the risk assessment with the same care he applied to everything. All right, he said. He went to get his book. Calhoun was behind his desk when they came in, and his expression when he saw both of them, Caleb and Evelyn together, Evelyn without any of the deference he'd perhaps expected, went through a quick reorganization. I wasn't expecting, he started. We have additional information relevant to the fire, Evelyn said. She sat down without being invited. Caleb sat beside her. She laid the copy of the night's notes on the desk, then the stock disappearance records, then the canceled orders, then the copy of Whitmore's letter. She laid them in sequence, deliberate and unhurried, the way you lay down a hand of cards when you're not trying to intimidate anyone, just showing what you have. Calhoun looked at the stack. There's one more thing, Caleb said. He described what Noah had seen, the wagon, the canvas cover, the ironwork with the maker's mark, the secondary warehouse with the red door. He described it in the same careful sequence Noah had used with Evelyn, without editorializing, without the obvious emotion he was managing with considerable effort. Calhoun was very quiet when he finished. The boy saw this, he said. 6 weeks ago, Evelyn said. He told me that night. I recorded the account the following morning. She pointed to the relevant page in the stack. That document was written before the fire, before this morning, before any of what happened today. The date and sequence are demonstrable. Calhoun looked at the page. He looked at the date. He turned it over as if checking for something on the back, then set it down. The secondary warehouse, he said. He seemed to be talking to himself more than to them. The one with the red door, Caleb said, on the alley behind the main building. Calhoun was quiet for a long time. She watched him sit with the accumulated weight of all of it, the stack of papers, the burn pattern report from his own deputy, the timeline that, when you laid it out clearly and in sequence, did not support the conclusion he'd been quietly endorsing for months. She watched him work through it, and she did not fill the silence, because she had learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is give a person room to arrive somewhere on their own. I'll go look, he said finally. This afternoon. With Sutter. Not with anyone from Whitmore's circle, Evelyn said. Calhoun's jaw tightened. Miss Carter, you don't tell me how to conduct my business. No, she said. I'm telling you that what you find in that warehouse, if you find it, needs to be something no one can argue was planted or misidentified. The only way to ensure that is to have it witnessed by someone with no connection to either side of this dispute. She held his gaze. Sutter seems like a careful man. A pause. He is, Calhoun said, with a complicated tone that suggested he appreciated Sutter's carefulness more than he'd ever admitted. Then take Sutter, she said. They left him with the copies. The originals went back into her apron pocket, and then, that evening, back into the space behind the kitchen wall. So, the afternoon was the hardest kind of waiting. Not the waiting before a known event, which has at least a shape to it, but the waiting that might mean anything. She baked bread she didn't need. She repaired a tear in Noah's shirt. Caleb went to the forge and worked because working was what he did when there was nothing else to do. The iron, a kind of thinking. Noah sat on the back steps and fed the barn cat pieces of bread that the cat disdained but tolerated. And he watched the alley gate the way children watch things when they're tracking whether adults' faces will tell them something. At 4:15, Sutter came to the door. He came alone, without Calhoun, and his face when she opened the door told her before he said a word that they had found something. He was young enough that he had not yet learned to keep his reactions entirely from his face, and what was on his face was the specific expression of a man who has looked at something he cannot explain away and is not sure what to do with that fact. "Ma'am," he said. He looked past her at Caleb, who had come in from the forge when he heard the knock. "We found the iron." The yard behind the forge was gold-lit in the late afternoon, and the mare was moving slowly along the fence, and Evelyn stood in her own doorway and felt the specific sensation of a thing she had been building toward for months becoming real. It was not triumph, it was not even relief exactly. It was more like the feeling of a long-held breath that you have forgotten you were holding, finally, carefully, letting go. "All of it?" Caleb asked. "Most. 12 pieces with the maker's mark. Clear strike, quarter-inch, just like you described." Sutter shifted his weight. There was other material, too. Property documents, account books. "The sheriff he is still in there." He paused. "There's a lot in there." She thought of what Noah had said at the kitchen table. He picked people who already had something against them. "How many names?" she asked. Sutter looked at her. "In the documents?" "In the property records." "How many families' land is in there?" He hesitated. "I counted 11 before the sheriff told me to step back." 11. Not one complaint. 11 families. 11 sets of people who had been picked for their vulnerability and used and discarded, and whose grievances had been absorbed into the general friction of frontier life, attributed to bad luck or bad management, or the kind of personal failure that people with red hair or dead husbands or insufficient connections were understood to be prone to. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at Sutter with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man who has just understood the true scale of something he thought he knew the shape of. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "The sheriff will want to talk to you both tomorrow," Sutter said. "Formally." He looked at Evelyn. "And the boy, if he's willing." She turned and looked at Noah, who was still on the back steps, the cat now asleep beside him, his book open on his knees and his eyes on her face. "He'll be willing," she said. She was certain of it, the way she was certain of very few things in her life. Noah would sit in whatever chair they put him in, and he would look at whatever man asked him questions, and he would tell the truth in the same careful, sequential way he had told it to her at the kitchen table, without embellishment and without apology. He would do it because he understood, with a clarity that embarrassed most of the adults around him, that this was what the records were for. Not just the written ones. The one in his head, which had been running since the night he couldn't sleep, and went outside to look at the stars and saw something he was not supposed to see, and decided, with the uncomplicated conviction of a 6-year-old who has been told that noticing things matters, to remember every detail of it. The last light was pulling back off the yard, and the mare was still walking the fence, and Silas Whitmore's warehouse was full of 11 families' worth of stolen lives, and Sutter was standing at the door waiting for something, and what he got was Evelyn Carter saying quietly, to no one in particular, "Write it down." Because that was how it started. Not with a fire, not with a confrontation in the street, not with the dramatic gesture or the obvious moment of reversal. It started years before, with a tin box under a workbench full of forgotten receipts, and a woman who understood that the distance between being wronged and proving it was exactly as long as the record you had kept. They had kept it. Now the record would do its work. Sutter came back the following morning with Calhoun, and this time the sheriff's face was different. Not transformed. Roy Calhoun was not a man who transformed easily, and the years of choosing comfort over conviction had left marks on him that a single afternoon in a warehouse couldn't erase. But something had settled in his expression that hadn't been there before. A kind of tired resolve, the face of a man who has run out of room to go sideways and has accepted reluctantly that forward is the only direction left. He sat at Caleb's kitchen table and he put his hat on his knee, and he did not look at Evelyn the way he had looked at her every previous time. The careful, not quite meeting of eyes that meant he was managing her as a problem rather than addressing her as a person. He looked at her directly, which cost him something, and she gave him credit for it. "The documents in the warehouse," he said. "Property deeds, account ledgers, correspondence. Some of it goes back 8 years. He paused. "There are names in there I recognize. Families that left town. One man who lost his grazing land 3 years ago and took his family to Oregon. We all thought he'd just failed at ranching." Another pause, heavier. He hadn't failed at anything. Caleb said nothing. Evelyn said nothing. Sometimes the right thing to do with a man arriving at a conclusion is to let him arrive. "Tom Briggs," Calhoun continued. "The witness Whitmore produced. He's a hired hand out of Cheyenne. No connection to Dry Creek before last month." He set his hat on the table. "He's been paid. I found the record." "In the warehouse?" Evelyn asked. "Whitmore kept everything." Calhoun said it with a tone that mixed disbelief and something approaching dark irony. "Every transaction, every payment. I think he kept it because he never believed he'd be looked at. He thought the records were safe because no one with authority to use them would ever go looking." "He was wrong about that," Caleb said. "He was." Calhoun looked at the table for a moment. "I owe you an apology, both of you. I knew he operated in ways I should have questioned more than I did. I told myself it was complicated, that he did enough good for the town that the rest of it wasn't my business." He stopped. That was convenient thinking. Evelyn watched him say it. He meant it, she thought. Or he meant it as much as a man can mean something when the meaning costs him a clear-eyed view of his own recent past. That was enough. She was not in the business of requiring people to feel worse than they already did. "What happens to Whitmore now?" she asked. "I've sent for the circuit judge. He'll be in Dry Creek within the week. In the meantime, I've served notice on Whitmore and taken custody of the warehouse documents." Calhoun picked his hat back up. "I'll need formal statements from both of you. And from the boy." "When?" Caleb asked. "This afternoon, if you're willing. I want it done before Whitmore's lawyer arrives from Cheyenne, which will happen as soon as Whitmore gets word through, which is probably already happening." Evelyn stood. "We'll be there at 2. Noah gave his statement sitting in the sheriff's office in his good shirt, which Evelyn had made him put on, because she understood instinctively that how a person presents themselves is part of what gets heard. He sat in the chair across from Calhoun, with his feet not quite reaching the floor, and he told everything in the same order. He told it at the kitchen table. The night he couldn't sleep, the stars, the wagon, the canvas cover, the ironwork with the stamp, the men's voices, the name Mr. White. Calhoun asked clarifying questions. Sutter took notes. Noah answered each question with the same direct, undecorated attention he gave to everything, correcting himself once when he realized he'd put 2 events in the wrong sequence, saying plainly, "No, wait, that came after," and adjusting without embarrassment because he was not performing certainty. He was actually trying to be accurate, which was a different thing and more reliable. When it was done, Calhoun looked at the boy for a moment. "You have a good memory," he said. "Mama says writing things down is the same as remembering," Noah said. "But I didn't have paper that night, so I just kept saying it in my head until I could tell her." Calhoun glanced at Evelyn. She kept her expression neutral. "Good thinking," the sheriff said. Noah accepted this without false modesty, the way children accept compliments when the thing being complimented is something they worked at and know to be true. He slid off the chair and looked at Evelyn. "Can I wait outside?" "Stay on the steps," she said. He went. Calhoun looked at the door he'd gone through and then looked at Evelyn with an expression she didn't try to interpret. "He'll be a formidable man someday," Calhoun said. "He's a formidable child right now," she said. "It's just that most people haven't noticed yet." Quote, Whitmore's lawyer arrived 2 days later, a man named Fitch from Cheyenne, who wore his coat like a credential and spoke in the particular measured cadences of someone who had learned that sounding reasonable is sometimes more effective than being reasonable. He set up in Whitmore's main store, which was still open for business because Whitmore had not yet been formally charged, and understood very well the value of appearing to conduct ordinary life while everything around him was in motion. The town noticed. That was the thing about a small town. It processed information laterally, person to person, in the spaces between transactions and at the ends of sentences that started as being about something else. Within 48 hours of Calhoun's visit to the warehouse, people who had not spoken directly to either Caleb or Evelyn knew, in the approximate way that townspeople know things, that something significant had been found and that it involved names they recognized. The families that had left. The land that had changed hands at prices people had privately thought were wrong, but had not said so because Whitmore was Whitmore. Marjorie Prentice came to the house on the second day. She came alone, without her husband, and she brought a covered dish that was a prairie chicken stew and set it on the table and did not offer any explanation for why she'd made it. She sat down and looked at Evelyn across the table and said, "My husband's brother sold his property to Whitmore 4 years ago. He said he had no choice because his note had been called in unexpectedly. We never understood who called it." Evelyn was very still. "Was the note held by a bank?" "We thought so, but the bank said they had no record of it after the sale. Dale always thought there was something wrong, but we didn't—" Marjorie stopped. "We didn't push because Whitmore had done us favors. And you don't push on someone who's done you favors, even when something's wrong." She looked at her hands. "Even when you should." "Would your husband be willing to give a statement?" Evelyn asked. "He'll be here tomorrow morning," Marjorie said. It came out like a decision that had been made before she walked through the door. Dale Prentice came at 8 in the morning and sat at the same table with a cup of coffee and told Evelyn everything he remembered about his brother's situation: dates, names, the sequence of events, the called note, the sale price that had always seemed low. She wrote it down. She wrote it with the same care she'd written everything, asking him to slow down when she needed to catch up, asking him to repeat details she wanted to be sure she had exactly right. When she was done, she read it back to him. He nodded. She had him sign the bottom of the page. "Calhoun should have this," he said. "He'll get a copy this afternoon," she said. "The original stays with us." Prentice looked at the page she was folding. "You always do that," he said. "Keep the original." "Always," she said. He was quiet a moment. "My wife told me you've been keeping records since you arrived." "Since I understood what we were dealing with, yes." He looked at his coffee. "I've lived in this town 12 years. I should have been keeping records." He said it with the plain, undefended quality of a genuine recognition, the kind that arrives when it's too late to be useful and becomes instead just something you carry. "We all should have." "You're keeping them now," she said. "That's what matters." He looked at her. "Is it enough?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But it's more than it was yesterday." So, the week before the circuit judge arrived was the strangest week of Evelyn's time in Dry Creek, because it was the week the town started to turn. And the turning was not clean or simple or unanimous. It was the messy, complicated turning of a community that had been complicit in something and was now reckoning with that complicity in the way communities do. Unevenly, defensively, with a mixture of genuine regret and motivated revisionism and ordinary human discomfort. The mothers who had kept their children from Noah did not all come at once. They came one at a time, in ways that were shaped more by social proximity to each other than by any individual moral reckoning. The first was a woman named Grace Holt, whose daughter Clara was 7 and had been in Noah's school class for 2 months without acknowledging his existence. Grace came to the door on a Wednesday evening and stood on the step with her hands clasped and said, without much preamble, that she thought Clara and Noah might like to play together on Saturday, if that suited. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "That would be fine," she said. "I'll let Noah know." She did not say, "It took you long enough." She did not say, "He cried through the wall about your daughter specifically, 4 weeks ago," because Clara had moved her slate to the far end of the table when he sat down. She said it would be fine, and she meant it, because the goal was not punishment. The goal was a life in this town, a real one, for her son and for herself. And you could not build a life on the foundation of other people's guilt. But she told Noah that evening in the kind of direct, honest terms she always used with him, because he deserved to make his own choice about it. "Grace Holt's daughter wants to play Saturday," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Clara moved her slate away from me. I know. She told the other kids my hair was the color of the devil's fire. Evelyn kept her face level. I know that too. He thought about it, picked up his wooden horse, set it down. Does she want to play because she actually wants to, or because her mother told her to? The question was so precisely calibrated to the actual complexity of the situation that Evelyn had to take a moment before answering. Probably both, she said. Probably her mother told her to, and probably some part of her is also actually curious about you, and the slate moving was partly about that. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. All right, he said, but if she moves her slate again, I'm going to say something about it. That seems fair, Evelyn said. Caleb heard about the turning from the supply side, which was its own category of information. 2 customers who had canceled orders in the weeks prior came back within days of each other, both with the slightly over-explained quality of men who understood that their original cancellations had required explanation that they hadn't provided. Caleb took both orders without comment on why they'd been canceled, which was the right thing to do and which she knew cost him something. Because Caleb was not a man who forgot, but was a man who understood when forgetting was the correct policy. The ironwork order for the Hendersons' new barn door came back specifically because old Walt Henderson had been in Whitmore's store when Fitch the lawyer arrived from Cheyenne and had watched Whitmore's face while Fitch was talking and had read something in it that he didn't like. Walt Henderson was 80 years old and had been reading men's faces across a frontier his entire life, and what he read in Whitmore's face was a man who was still calculating angles rather than confronting the fact that the angles were gone. He came to the forge the following day, put down his order deposit, and said to Caleb without any surrounding explanation, I should have ordered from you 6 months ago. I didn't because Whitmore suggested I use the other smith, and I took the suggestion because it was easier. I'm not taking his suggestions anymore. Caleb said, I'll have it ready in 3 weeks. Walt Henderson nodded and left, and that was the whole conversation, and it mattered more than any apology would have. The circuit judge, a man named Arthur Desmond, arrived on a Thursday on the afternoon stage, and he was not what the town had perhaps expected. He was in his late 50s, compact and unhurried, and he had the quality of a man who had seen enough variations of the same fundamental human behavior that very little surprised him, which in a judge was either reassuring or alarming depending on what you needed him to do. He spent his first day reading documents. Calhoun had organized everything: the warehouse contents, the formal statements, Evelyn's records, which she had delivered in full copy. And Desmond read it with the focused, slightly detached attention of a professional who is not looking for a story, but for a structure. Evelyn was not present for that first day. She did not need to be. The records would speak for themselves, or they wouldn't, and her presence would not improve them. What she did that Thursday was go to the school at 3 o'clock and walk Noah home the long way, past the hardware store and the post office, and the stretch of the main street she had walked on her first day, with her trunk in the dirt, and Harold Baines's green vest already receding into the crowd. And she walked it now in the autumn afternoon and let herself feel, carefully, what it felt like. Different. Not safe. She was not so far gone in optimism as to call it safe yet. But different. The quality of being watched had changed. It was still present. Small towns are always watching. But the watching had shifted from the hostile, superstitious scrutiny of her first weeks towards something more complicated. Something that included, in some faces, the particular averted attention of people who know they behaved badly and haven't yet decided whether to say so. Noah walked beside her with his book under his arm and his wooden horse in his pocket where it had lived since he was 3 years old, and he said, "Are we going to stay?" "I think so," she said. "If things go the way I hope." "What if they don't?" She thought about this honestly. "Then we figure out the next thing. We always have." He was quiet for half a block. "I like it here," he said. "Now, I didn't at first." A pause. "I like Mr. Caleb." She did not respond to that directly. She was not ready to respond to that directly. "He likes you too," she said. "That's been obvious for a while." Noah looked up at her. "I meant as a father," he said, with the complete absence of self-consciousness of someone who is describing a factual state rather than expressing a wish. She kept walking. "I know what you meant." "Do you like him? As a—" "Noah, I'm just asking." "I'm aware of what you're doing." She looked at him sideways. He was trying very hard not to smile, which was one of his tells. Walk. He walked, and he did not push it further, but she was aware of the smile he was suppressing all the way to Caleb's front gate, and she was aware also of something she had been not thinking about carefully for months, rising to the surface with the unhurried persistence of a thing that is going to be thought about eventually, whether you invite it or not. Desmond called the formal hearing on Saturday morning. It was not a trial, not yet. It was a preliminary proceeding, the judge's determination of whether what had been found in the warehouse constituted sufficient grounds for formal charges and what those charges should be. But the distinction between a preliminary hearing and a trial is largely technical when the warehouse contains 11 families' stolen property and a paper trail 8 years long, and the room that Calhoun had arranged in the town hall filled to its limit before 8 in the morning with people who understood this. Silas Whitmore sat at the front with Fitch beside him, and he was dressed impeccably, and his face was controlled in the way that a face is controlled when considerable effort is being applied to the control. Evelyn noted from across the room that the control had small failures in it, a tightness around the jaw that released and returned, a stillness of the hands that was too deliberate to be natural. He was afraid. That was what controlled fear looked like on a man who had not been afraid in a very long time and had forgotten how to carry it. Fitch argued procedural objections for 20 minutes. Desmond listened to all of them with the patient attention of a man doing his job, and then declined each one with the efficient brevity of a man who had heard them all before and was not impressed. The gallery shifted through this section with the restlessness of people who had come for something and were waiting for it. What they came for was the documents. Calhoun presented them methodically piece by piece, the property deeds with forged signatures, the account books showing payments to witnesses, including Tom Briggs, whose record was specific enough to include dates and amounts, the correspondence between Whitmore and a land broker in Cheyenne that laid out, in Whitmore's own handwriting, the strategy of identifying vulnerable property owners and accelerating their difficulties through supply interference, credit manipulation, and what Whitmore had referred to, in one letter, as social pressure of the conventional kind, which was a phrase that landed in the room like something dropped from a height. The 12 pieces of iron with Caleb's maker's mark were entered into evidence. Desmond examined one of them, running his thumb across the struck stamp, and set it on the table in front of him. The room was very quiet. Fitch made 3 more arguments. Desmond heard them, declined them. He looked at Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I have read the material recovered from your secondary warehouse. I have read the statements provided by the sheriff and by the residents of this town. I have also read a set of contemporaneous records provided by Miss Evelyn Carter, which document events in a sequence and with a specificity that I find, frankly, impressive for a private citizen with no legal training." He picked up the iron piece again, seemed to consider it, set it down. "These records, combined with the material recovered from your warehouse, establish a pattern of conduct that I am not prepared to dismiss on procedural grounds." Whitmore said something to Fitch in a low voice. Fitch stood. "Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Fitch." Desmond did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I will be issuing a formal warrant for the arrest of Silas Whitmore on charges of property fraud, theft, bribery of witness testimony, and destruction of private property. I will be recommending that the district court convene a full hearing to determine restitution for the affected families." He looked at the room. "I understand several of those families are no longer in Dry Creek. Their interests will be represented." The room released its breath in stages, like pressure coming off something that had been compressed for too long. Whitmore sat very still. In the end, that was what she would remember about him at that moment. Not anger, not protest, just the stillness of a man who had built an entire architecture of safety around himself and had just watched it disassemble in the space of a morning. Calhoun crossed the room and stood beside him and said something quietly, and Whitmore stood, and they went out together through the side door, and the room moved and shifted and voices rose, and Evelyn sat in her chair and looked at the iron piece still sitting on the judge's table with Caleb's mark struck into it a 1/4 inch deep, the way he'd done it for 12 years, and she thought, "You wrote it down. You just wrote it in metal instead of paper." She felt Caleb's hand close around hers, briefly, and release it. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Beside her, Noah was watching the judge gather his papers with the focused attention of a child storing something for future reference. She knew he was writing it down in his own way. His head. His reliable, infuriating, extraordinary head. "Is it over?" he asked. "This part," she said. "What's the next part?" She thought about what she'd said to him on the walk home from school, the careful, honest version she'd given because he always deserved the honest version. She thought about Marjorie Prentice and Dale Prentice and Walt Henderson and Grace Holt and Clara, who had moved her slate, and two customers who had come back with over-explained apologies that Caleb had accepted without comment. "The next part," she said, "is finding out what this town is like when people in it aren't being managed by someone who profits from them being afraid of each other." Noah considered this. "What if it's not that different?" "Then we'll know that too," she said, "and we'll make decisions accordingly." He nodded, processing. "But you think it will be different?" She looked at the room, the talking, the shifting, the faces of people working through what they'd just witnessed, some of them calculating and some of them genuinely shaken, and some of them already moving toward each other in the way of people who have shared something that reconfigures their understanding of where they are. It was not a transformed room. It was a complicated room. It was a room that had been doing something wrong for a long time and had just been shown the evidence and was now in the early, uncertain stages of deciding what to do with that fact. "I think some of it will be," she said, "and that'll have to be enough." She found Caleb standing outside afterward, in the thin autumn sun, looking at nothing in particular. He had the expression he got when he was processing something too large to process quickly, the particular inward-looking stillness. She stood beside him. 11 families," he said. 11 that we know of," she said. "There may be more." "If he hadn't come after us," Caleb stopped. "If he'd left us alone, those 11 families would just have stayed gone. Their land would have stayed his." "Yes." He was quiet. She understood what he was sitting with, the particular moral vertigo of realizing that your own suffering was also, accidentally, the mechanism by which someone else's justice became possible. That wasn't a comfortable thing to carry, because it implied a calculus around suffering that most decent people don't want to make. "You didn't cause what happened to them," she said. "He did. You were just the record that was kept." He looked at her. "We," he said, "the record we kept." "We," she agreed. He turned back to the street. A woman she didn't know was talking to Calhoun near the door of the hall, gesturing with the urgent, detailed gestures of someone who has been waiting to say something for a long time and is finally saying it. Someone Whitmore had gotten to, she thought. Another thread pulling loose. "The forge needs a new wall section," Caleb said after a while. "The northeast corner." "I know." "I was thinking about adding on. There's enough room on the east side to expand the ironwork floor." He paused. "If the orders keep coming back, I'll need the space." She looked at him. He was looking at the street. "That sounds like a plan," she said. "It's early for a plan. It's an idea." "All right, an idea." He turned and looked at her directly, the way he did when he had decided to say something and was not going to dress it up. "I have another idea," he said. "That's been in my head longer than the forge expansion." The street was busy around them. Someone called to someone else across the way. A horse complained at the hitching post. All the ordinary sounds of a Thursday in a small town where something large had just shifted under the surface. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't said it yet." "I know that too." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I have the same idea." A long pause. Not uncomfortable. The same quality of silence she had learned to read in him months ago, in the early mornings over coffee. The particular quiet of a man taking something in without performance. "I don't know how to be a husband," he said. "I was one before, and I wasn't very good at the parts that weren't practical." "I don't know how to be a wife in the way people here seem to expect," she said. "I kept my own accounts and had opinions and didn't defer when I thought deferring was wrong." "I know that about you." "I know you know. I'm saying it clearly so there's no confusion later." He almost smiled. "You always say things clearly so there's no confusion later." "It saved a considerable amount of confusion," she said. "It has." He was quiet a moment. "Noah, what about him?" "I want to ask him," Caleb said, "before I ask you, or along with asking you. I haven't worked out the order." He rubbed the back of his neck. I want to know if it's what he wants, not just what we decide is good for him. She looked at this man, at the burn scar on his forearm, and the careful hands and the face that had weathered things without dramatizing them, who had picked up a stranger's trunk from the dirt because someone ought to, and had meant it in the most uncomplicated way possible. And she felt something settle in her that had not been settled in a very long time. He already told me what he wants, she said, last week, in the most direct terms available to a 6-year-old. Caleb raised an eyebrow. He asked me if I liked you as a... She paused. He was specific about what he meant. Caleb's face did the thing it did when something landed that he hadn't expected, the brief undefended moment before the composure came back. What did you tell him? I told him to walk, she said. He did smile then, fully, which was rare enough that it changed his whole face, and she was not going to say what it did to her to see it because she was not, she firmly believed, a woman who needed to narrate every significant interior event. We'll ask him together, she said. Tonight, at supper. All right, Caleb said. And Caleb? She looked at him steadily. The answer is yes. To the idea you haven't said yet, so you can stop working out how to say it. He looked at her. That's not how it's supposed to go. I'm aware of how it's supposed to go, she said. I'm also aware of what we've both been carrying for several months, and I don't see the virtue in making it take longer than necessary. He was quiet for a moment. You couldn't just let me say it. You can still say it. I'm just telling you what the answer will be when you do. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up her hand with both of his, the calloused, careful hands that made things out of iron and had held her trunk out of the dirt on the first day of everything. And he held it without ceremony or performance, just held it, in the middle of the street in the thin autumn sun with Dry Creek moving around them and 11 families' worth of justice beginning the slow work of becoming real. She let him hold it. She did not say anything else. She had said the necessary things, and sometimes that was enough, and the rest could be silence. But it was, as she had learned, the right kind of silence. They asked Noah at supper, as agreed. Caleb had made the meal himself, which he did occasionally on evenings when he felt the need to do something with his hands beyond the forge work, and what he produced was never elegant but was always substantial. A beef stew that had been going since mid-afternoon, cornbread that came out slightly uneven on one side, a pot of coffee that was stronger than necessary. Noah had set the table without being asked, which he'd started doing sometime in the past month without either of them remarking on it, and the three of them sat in the kitchen in the particular easy quiet that had become their version of ordinary. Caleb looked at Evelyn once across the table. She gave him nothing, because she had told him he could still say it, and she meant that. He set down his spoon. He looked at Noah, who was eating with the focused efficiency of a child who takes food seriously. Noah, he said, I want to ask you something. Noah looked up. He read the quality of the moment immediately. He always did. And set his own spoon down and gave Caleb his full attention, which with Noah was a complete thing, no portion of it elsewhere. I'd like to marry your mother, Caleb said. And I'd like, if it's something you want, to be your father. Not in place of your father. I know you had one. But in addition to what he was. He paused. You don't have to decide right now. And if the answer is no, or not yet, or something in between, that's an honest answer, and I'll take it. Noah was quiet for a moment that was just long enough to establish that he was actually thinking rather than performing thinking. I already call you Pa in my head, he said. I just didn't say it out loud because I didn't know if it was allowed. Caleb's face did the thing it did when something arrived that he hadn't braced for. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at Noah. It's allowed, he said. His voice was level, but she could hear what it cost to keep it that way, and she loved him for the effort. Noah picked his spoon back up. Okay, he said, and returned to his stew with the composure of someone who has resolved an important matter and sees no reason to belabor it. Evelyn looked at the cornbread. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry at the supper table over cornbread and a 6-year-old's practical declaration of love, because she was not that kind of woman, and also because she absolutely was and always had been, and had simply gotten good at choosing the moment. She waited until Noah was in bed. Then she cried briefly in the kitchen while Caleb washed the dishes, and he didn't say anything about it, which was exactly right. The formal charges against Silas Whitmore were filed by the district court 3 weeks after Judge Desmond's preliminary hearing. They were extensive. property fraud across 11 documented cases, with 2 additional cases identified after the initial review when former residents were located and contacted. Theft of materials. Bribery of a witness. Tom Briggs, who had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced charge, and had done so with the slightly greenish expression of a man who has made a number of poor choices and is now in the process of paying for them sequentially. Conspiracy to destroy private property, which covered the fire, Fitch argued. Fitch argued extensively and with genuine skill, and some of what he argued had merit in the technical sense, the kind of merit that the law produces when it is applied to situations where the law was not designed to protect the people most harmed. But the warehouse documents were too specific and too numerous and too much in Whitmore's own handwriting to be argued around, and the maker's mark on 12 pieces of iron was a 1/4 inch deep and 12 years old and did not respond to legal argument. Whitmore was convicted on 7 of 9 counts. He received a sentence that included substantial fines and the forfeiture of properties obtained through fraud, which encompassed most of what he'd built in Dry Creek over the past decade. He served time. Not as much time as 11 families might have felt was proportionate, but time, and the forfeiture, which was the part that mattered in practical terms, was real and was enforced. Evelyn did not attend the sentencing. She had given what the legal process needed from her, and she did not feel compelled to watch the outcome as a spectator. She heard about it from Calhoun, who came to the house that afternoon with his hat in his hand and told her in the direct, slightly uncomfortable way of a man still learning how to be straightforward with people he'd previously managed from a distance. 7 counts, he said, forfeiture of properties. He's done here. The families, she said, the 11. The restitution process has started. It'll take time. Some of the property has changed hands twice since he took it, which complicates things. The judge has appointed a trustee. He paused. Some of them will get land back. Some will get compensation instead. It won't be whole, but it won't be nothing. She nodded. She had known it wouldn't be whole. That was one of the things she'd had to make peace with early, that justice and wholeness are not the same thing, and demanding they be the same thing is a way of refusing the imperfect version that's actually available. The imperfect version was what had happened today. It was enough to be going on with. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. He looked at her. "I should have been doing my job properly from the beginning," he said. "You shouldn't have needed to build that record yourself." "No," she agreed. "I shouldn't have." He accepted this. "I'm going to do it better." "I hope so," she said. "Dry Creek will be better for it if you do." He left, and she stood in the doorway for a moment in the late afternoon, and the town looked the same as it always had. The same street, the same buildings, the same sky going orange and pink in the west. And it was not transformed. It was not the shiny new place that stories sometimes promised people when the villain was caught and the records were vindicated. It was just Dry Creek on a Thursday in November, working through what it was, the way all places work through what they are. Imperfectly, unevenly, with some people doing better than before, and some people unchanged and some arguments about it all going on for years afterward. But the Whitmore machinery was gone, and that was not nothing. The wedding was in April. Evelyn had not wanted a large ceremony, and Caleb had not wanted any ceremony at all, so they compromised on small, which in Dry Creek translated into approximately 40 people because small in a small town is a relative concept. Mrs. Alderman closed the school for the afternoon. Marjorie Prentice made a cake that was architecturally uncertain but tasted, by general agreement, better than anything in recent memory. Evelyn wore her second-best dress, which she had altered over the winter with pieces of ivory lace she'd found at the dry goods store. She had not bought a new dress. She was not performing a transformation for the town's benefit. She was marrying a man in the dress she had, the same dress she'd worn on ordinary Sundays, and occasionally to Calhoun's office to deliver documents. And she thought that was honest in a way that a purchased dress would not have been. Noah walked beside her down the aisle, which was the center space between chairs borrowed from the town hall arranged in the yard behind the church, because the church itself was too small. He wore his good shirt and his hair was combed, and he carried the rings on a small wooden board that Caleb had made for the purpose, with a groove cut into it so they wouldn't roll. He walked with the composure of someone who has been given an important responsibility and intends to discharge it correctly, and he did not drop the rings. And when they reached the front and he handed them over, he stepped back and stood straight and looked at Caleb with the expression of a boy who has decided this is how things are going to be and is entirely at peace with the decision. Caleb looked at Evelyn in the April sun, and he said what he had to say in the plain, unembellished way he said everything, without rehearsed phrases or borrowed sentiment. And what he said was simply that he had not known, before she came, how empty a full house could be, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life in the opposite condition. She said what she had to say, which was that she had crossed 800 miles looking for solid ground and had found it in a place she hadn't expected, built by hands that understood the value of what they made. It was not a long ceremony. The April afternoon was cool and the sky was clear, and afterward people ate Marjorie's uncertain cake and talked in the way people talk when they have something to celebrate and are still a little uncertain how to do it comfortably, which is how people talk at most celebrations if you pay attention. Walt Henderson shook Caleb's hand for a long time without saying very much. Dale Prentice brought a bottle of something he'd been keeping for an occasion and seemed relieved to have an occasion. Clara Holt, who had been Noah's closest companion for the past 4 months in the sudden, total way of children's friendships, attached herself to his side and told him in an authoritative whisper that the cake was better than it looked. "Everything here is better than it looks," Noah said, and she wasn't sure whether he meant the cake specifically or something larger, but with Noah you were never entirely sure, and she had stopped trying to be. She stood in the afternoon with a plate she wasn't eating from and watched her son move through the gathered people of Dry Creek with the ease of someone who has stopped waiting for the ground to shift under him and has decided to trust it, and she felt the full weight of what that had cost. Not just her, but him, the specific cost paid by a child who learns early that the world is not automatically safe, who has to earn belonging by surviving the absence of it, and who carries that knowledge into every room for the rest of his life, even the rooms where he is loved. It was not a small cost. She would not pretend it was. But watching him there, in the April yard, with Clara Holt stealing food from his plate and Caleb's hand briefly on his shoulder as he passed, she thought, he is going to be all right. Not because everything was all right now, not because the months of painted walls and moved slates and children calling him Rusthead had been erased, but because he had walked through all of it and come out the other side knowing he could. And that knowledge was a different kind of foundation than the one she'd been trying to build for him when she packed her life into a trunk and boarded the stagecoach with 41 letters and the particular desperate hope of someone who has exhausted every other option. That foundation wasn't perfect. Nothing was. But it was real, and it was his, and no one could take it from him. The forge expansion was finished by June. The new northeast wall went up first, proper timber, properly joined, Caleb doing most of the framing himself with help from Dale Prentice's son and one of the Henderson boys who turned out to have a good eye for level. The ironwork floor extension opened the working space considerably, and by July the order book was fuller than it had been in 2 years, which Evelyn recorded in the ledger with the same care she brought to everything she recorded, and which Caleb observed with the quiet satisfaction of a man who does not need to say a great deal about good things, because he has learned through experience that good things don't require narration. She kept the books. She also, by the end of the first year, kept the books for 3 other businesses in Dry Creek, 2 of whom had come to her after watching what the records had done in Whitmore's case, and understanding belatedly that documented accounts were not a luxury for large operations, but a survival tool for small ones. She charged a fair rate. She was good at it in the way she was good at everything she'd decided to be good at. Not through natural brilliance, but through the particular discipline of someone who has learned that preparation is the only form of luck you can actually manufacture. One evening in late autumn of that second year, Caleb came in from the forge and found her at the table with 3 sets of ledgers spread open and Noah doing his schoolwork at the other end of the same table, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the scene before he said anything. "You're doing it again," he said. She didn't look up. "Doing what?" "The thing where you work until I come in from the forge, and then you don't stop and I have to find something to do so you can finish. I'll be done in 20 minutes. You said that last week." "I was done in 25, she said. "That's close." He sat down across from her and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left on the stove, and Noah looked up from his schoolwork and said, "She's been at it since 4, with the tone of someone filing a witness report. "Whose side are you on?" Evelyn asked without looking up. "I'm just reporting facts," Noah said. "You taught me to report facts." Caleb looked at the boy with the expression he had developed over 18 months of parenthood, which was a mixture of genuine amusement and the slight disorientation of a man who had not anticipated that raising a child would involve being outmaneuvered by him on a regular basis. "Fair enough," he said. Evelyn closed the last ledger. She looked up at both of them, the man with the coffee and the boy with the school book and the barn cat that had relocated to Noah's lap at some point without anyone noticing. And she felt very precisely and without sentimentality the specific weight of having arrived somewhere. Not the end of difficulty. She was too honest for that framing. There would be other winters, other problems, other mornings when the money was tighter than she'd like, and other weeks when Caleb was quieter than was comfortable, and other days when Noah came home from school carrying something he didn't want to talk about, and she would have to decide all over again whether to push or to wait. That was not a story that ended. That was the actual texture of a life, which was uneven and imperfect and contained long stretches of ordinary difficulty interrupted by occasional genuine joy and required constant maintenance, like any other structure worth keeping. But she had arrived. That much was true. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in a second-best dress with a trunk in the dirt and a child's hand in hers, she had arrived somewhere real. Years later, people in Dry Creek would still tell the story. It would change in the telling, the way all stories change. Details would sharpen or blur, the timeline would compress, the warehouse full of documents would become more dramatic, and the fire more devastating, and the courtroom more cinematic than any of it had actually been. Noah would become, in some versions, older than 6, because the idea of a 6-year-old being the linchpin of the whole thing seemed, to some tellers, too improbable to leave intact. But those who had actually been there, Walt Henderson, who lived to be 93, and Marjorie Prentice, and Sheriff Roy Calhoun, who did in fact do his job better afterward and knew why, those people told it plain, because the plain version was already extraordinary enough. A woman arrived with nothing but her child and the truth about herself, and the town decided that wasn't enough. And she decided very quietly, without making a show of the deciding, that she was going to prove the town wrong, not by becoming something different, but by becoming more completely what she already was. Patient, careful, precise, willing to write things down and wait for the writing to matter. The truth, as Evelyn would have told it, and she was not a woman who told her own story very often because she found it more interesting to help other people manage theirs, is that she had not set out to expose anyone. She had set out to survive. The record-keeping was not a plan for justice. It was a plan for not being erased, which is a different thing, a smaller thing, the most basic thing a person can reach for when the world has decided they don't belong in it. What happened to Whitmore was the consequence of that small reaching, not the intention. The intention was just, be here, stay here, make this real. She had done that. It was enough. What she had not anticipated, and this was the thing she thought about, in the quiet moments, when she tried to understand what the whole of it had meant, was that the act of insisting on her own reality would end up insisting on other people's too. That the records she kept to protect herself would become the records that recovered 11 families' worth of stolen lives. She had not planned this. She was not a hero of her own story in the way stories sometimes need their protagonists to be. She was a woman who kept good books and refused to leave, and those two qualities, applied consistently over time, had produced a consequence larger than she'd aimed for. That was what she thought about. Not the wedding or the forge expansion or the moment Calhoun had come to the door with his hat in his hands. Not even Noah's quiet declaration at the supper table, "I already call you Pa," in my head. Though that one she carried differently from the others, more carefully, like something that could break if she held it wrong. What she thought about was this, that most of what matters is not dramatic. It is not the moment in the street or the document on the judge's table or the conversation that changes everything. It is the morning before that, when you get up and make coffee and open the ledger and write down what happened the day before, accurately, without embellishment, because the truth is the only thing you're sure you own. It is the 10 minutes you spend counting iron stock when you would rather be doing something else. It is the hand flat on the wall in the dark, while your child cries on the other side of it, and you stay there, staying, because staying is the one thing you can always choose. It is the ordinary persistence, the small, unglamorous, repetitive choice to keep going, to keep noticing, to keep writing it down. That was what she knew. That was what Dry Creek had cost her, and given her both. The proof, accumulated across a year of hard evidence, that showing up is its own form of power. Not the loud kind, not the kind that burns fast and bright and needs to be witnessed, the kind that builds and builds and builds until one day someone looks at what you've made and understands that it was never going to move. She was in her kitchen on a Thursday evening in November, 2 years after the stagecoach. The forge was cooling for the night and Caleb would be in soon. Noah was at the table with his school book, doing the thing he'd been doing since he was old enough to hold a pencil, writing things down, keeping his own record of the days, in a handwriting that was getting cleaner and more confident with every passing month. She poured 2 cups of coffee and left one at Caleb's place. She sat down across from her son. Outside, Dry Creek made its evening sounds. The settling of buildings, a horse somewhere, the wind that came down off the distant mountains in November with the smell of snow still weeks away but already promised. The lamp on the table put warm light on Noah's bent head, and on the page where he was writing, and on the coffee cups, and on the room. They were all in together, the room that had started as a stranger's charity and had become, through no single dramatic gesture, but through the long accumulation of ordinary days, the place in the world where she most completely was. The door opened. Caleb came in from the cold, bringing with him the smell of iron and wood smoke, and he looked at the two of them the way he always looked at them when he came in at the end of the day, with the expression of a man who is still, after all this time, slightly surprised to find them there, and grateful for the surprise. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. Noah didn't look up from his writing. "She already counted the stock," he said, "and reconciled the October figures." "I heard," Caleb said. "The Henderson order is ahead of schedule," Noah continued, "and the new ledger for the Prentice account is on the shelf." "Were you listening to everything again?" Evelyn asked. "I was in the next room," he said. "The walls are thin." "They are," Caleb agreed. Noah looked up then, at both of them, with the expression that meant he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "I'm going to keep records too," he said, "when I'm grown. Whatever I do, I'm going to write it all down." She looked at her son, at the careful, serious face of the boy who had been called Rusthead and Witch Boy, and had walked through it and come out the other side, knowing something most people his age didn't know yet, and many people never learned, that your story belongs to you. That belonging to you means you have to be the one to tell it, and to tell it accurately, and to keep the original. "Good," she said. She picked up her coffee. The lamp burned. Outside the window, the night was full and cold and clean, and the town of Dry Creek went on being what it was, but imperfect, complicated, capable of cruelty and of repair, the way all places are, the way all people are. And inside the kitchen of a blacksmith's house on the east side of the main street, a family that had no reason to exist and every reason to stay sat together in the ordinary light and did not need to say anything more. Some things don't require narration. This was